Hello and welcome. Today is Friday, January 7th, 2022. My name is Gray. I am your host. I am also a cast member of the Isle Misfit Rules podcast, where I play two characters, Chakunatuk, also known as Chak, the lizardfolk druid, as well as Bach, the awakened raccoon artificer. I hope that you will join us in our campaign through the world of Veritas. I will put the links below in case you haven't listened to us before. We will also be converting over to a Twitch live stream later on this year. So if you want to participate in that, I'll put the link below. You'll be able to see this ugly mug, as well as those of my fellow players and DM Mike, as we continue with our campaign. Mike has been a fantastic DM up to this point, and we are really looking forward to season 2. However, our stories in Veritas will eventually come to an end, and the question becomes is what do we do next? Well, I put some thought into this, and to be honest, Mike is a player at heart. He's been doing a fantastic job DMing, but I'm fairly certain that he would love to play in Veritas rather than run it. And at the same time, I myself don't necessarily want to run a game in Veritas. That is Mike's baby, as I like to call it. So, what do I do? Because I want to put that same sort of appeal of the Veritas setting into something, but at the same time, I don't want to necessarily use what Mike has already created in case he ever wants to run a game in the campaign world again. So what I managed to put together is what if I run a campaign in the same setting several thousand years in the future? And Veritas is only like a small portion of the world or campaign setting, which I never need to touch at all, sort of deal. I can look at the rest of the universe or galaxy and make it the playground, the sandbox that the players will truly love. That is why I decided to call this vlog Misfits of the Galaxy. Kind of riff on Guardians of the Galaxy, but what the hey. So with that in mind, I've decided to make a space opera 5th edition game. I chose to go with 5th edition because all the players in the group are familiar with the 5th edition rule set, and our few forays into alternative rule sets have left something to be desired, to say the very least. Sorry, guys. Anyways, with that said, I wanted to do something different. I didn't necessarily want to do 100% high fantasy, which is why I chose space opera. And I'm going to be using some of the rules out of the Dark Matter rule set from Mage Hand Press. I'll put the link for them down below. They make, in no way is this video sponsored by them. They make some fantastic products, and I really hope that you will take a look at them sooner or later. Anyways, with that said, so I'm going to use part of that, and it's going to be a culmination of both sci-fi and high magic and fantasy. Very similar vein to what Spelljammer once was, without the miniature giant space hamsters, or maybe they'll be here in the campaign. I don't know yet. Anyways, so this vlog is more of a process for me where I ramble for a bit as I try to get my thoughts out to help me with writing the campaign. I have a whole bunch of thoughts and ideas and a whole bunch of little notes scribbled all over the place, and I try to compile them together into these 15-minute, I guess, vlogs or videos. This one is probably going to be closer to 20 minutes. I do apologize for those that were expecting 15 minutes, but the reality of the matter is this introduction is taking a little bit longer than I initially thought. All right, so with that underway, let's just get into the meat of things. This is the last episode I discussed the Halflings of the world. Just briefly, the Halflings' homeworld is abundance. And And it reminds everyone of the Shire from The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, with the halflings themselves being the epitome of Hobbiton or Hobbitese or whatever you want to call it, where like they are very much the hobbits from J.R. Tolkien's works for all intensive purposes, which is a throwback to how they were originally presented in like the first Beckme, as well as I think all the way up till 3rd edition D&D. But anyways, so they live on a world of rolling hills and lazy rivers where nothing really important ever happens, and most of their young end up leaving the world because otherwise they might die of boredom, which leaves them with a aging population crisis. The halflings have tried to figure out how to resolve this issue clearly, and the way they're resolving it right now is through cross species adoption. And the one species I mentioned most about in the last episode were orcs being adopted by halflings. This was inspired by a image I found on online of a halfling and a orc, and the orc was the adopted daughter of the halfling. It was a fantastic image. It really inspired me on this, and I found the creator's Tumblr, and so I'll post a link to the image down below. Please, like, give him or her, I'm not exactly certain, all the praise for that idea, because that definitely inspired me to throw it into this campaign. So with that said, I said I would develop this campaign organically, going from one topic to the next based on the ramblings. So I guess I'm going to go into orcs because that's where I kind of left off. This might end up being a two-parter because there's a fair bit of material to go through. But let me begin. So the orcs I envision in this galaxy are very much like the World of Warcraft orcs, in culturally, I should say, where they are noble or they are honorable. They have a clan or tribe based culture, and they have only recently gone from being a hunting gathering society to an agrarian society where they're living in settlements and growing crops and what have you. So the world that they come from is a world called Dughash, Dukagsh, and that is a throwback to Spelljammer. In Spelljammer, that Dughash was the homeworld of the Scrow, which were the Spelljammer equivalent of orcs. They were highly militarized and quite intelligent in comparison to the normal pig-snouted orcs of the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons era. So I thought I'd give them a bit of a homage here. So Dughash has never been a nice world to live on. It's a bit hostile to its inhabitants. It has drastic seasonal changes where you'll have floods during the spring, you'll have scorching summers and brutally harsh winters. And in order to combat this, many of the species that live on the world either migrate in seasonal patterns or they hibernate. The orcs follow the migration patterns of the various herds of game that they hunted for countless generations. However, recently they've started settling down in valleys with more temperate climates and the like, with their homeworld being mountainous with a fair number of plains throughout it. with that said, they have a rich and vibrant culture that unfortunately has met an untimely demise. And the best way to describe it is if you have ever familiarized yourself or watched Babylon 5 and the relationship between the Narn and the Centauri, or Star Trek with the Bajorans and the Cardassians, you have a good idea where I'm going with this, with intergalactic colonialism. So in this case, I wanted to take the intergalactic colonialism, show that the Orcs once had a vibrant culture, but was unfortunately destroyed by this. And at the same time, I wanted to give a good reason as to why Orcs and Elves always seem to have this animosity towards one another, and regardless as to what media you read, watch, or listen to. Like, you look at J.R. Tolkien, Orcs and Elves don't get along. You look at D&D, Orcs and Elves don't get along. You look at any sort of anime or manga or comic series, they don't get along there either. In D&D, it's because because of religious beliefs, where Corellian, Lorathan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Grumpsh have been enemies from the very beginning. And in Tolkien, it's because the spoilers, the elves and the orcs are related somewhat, and the orcs are like corrupted elves. At least I think so, from the way I interpreted things when I read it back in the day. I may be wrong, but anyways, in this setting, the elves are one of the older races. They reached the stars far before any of the other younger races, and they developed high magics long before any others. Just like in most campaign settings, these elves have this ancient culture and society that has lasted tens of thousands of years. The orcs, on the other hand, like I said, they had just reached a point where they were going to start settling. The elves themselves, I don't want to go into too much more details, but needless to say, they're divided into noble houses that are constantly plotting and conspiring against one another, very much like Frank Herbert's Dunes with their noble houses. I do apologize for anyone who's listening to this and see me using a lot of references here and there. It's just, for me, it's easier to like give an example from another source of media, because I am familiar with all these. For those that aren't, I am terribly sorry yet again. However, so the elven houses noble houses are constantly conspiring against one another. One of the houses, one of their exploratory vessels, discovered Dugash, the homeworld of the orcs, and shortly thereafterwards, the elves went about making introductions and diplomatic relations with the orcs. Though those diplomatic relations were a little bit one-sided or lopsided. The elves had incredible magic and technology at their disposal, which they offered to share some of that with the orcs in exchange for concessions. Being very fractured and what have you, the strongest tribes readily agreed with the concessions of the elves, seeking to gain even more power over the other tribes, which they saw as not necessarily their foes, but the competitors for territory and resources. So the elves began to harvest resources from the planet. Like, quite literally, they strip mined the mountains. They killed off most of the wild game to nearly extinction levels. They plopped down giant industrial factories on the world where they could use cheap orcish labor to produce various products and goods. This resulted in like orcish society almost crumbling overnight, and the world becoming much of the world becoming a wasteland as magical and industrial pollutants began to seep into the soil and fill the air. The orcs, however, have always been a hardy, strong people, so they endured. As the resources of the world were being depleted, this noble house of elves needed more conscripts for their military and their house guard to fight in their never-ending battles and wars against other elven houses, not to mention outside threats. So they began to recruit, and I use recruit very loosely, the orcish youth, taking them off-world and training them in harsh conditions, and then sending them off to war in battle, and in many cases die on worlds, not other worlds, not knowing who they were, why they were fighting, uh, and never seeing their homeworld again. So almost an entire generation of orcs were wiped out by just being conscripted into the elvish military complex, which is pretty brutal. Not all of them died, though. A few of them survived and became veterans of countless wars and conflicts. Eventually, that house of elves ran into some trouble and were forced to make concessions when they lost a great war or battle. One of the concessions was a reduction in their military forces, and in order to achieve that, they released most of the orcs from their service, which resulted in a whole bunch of orcs being kind of given a pat on the back, said you done a good job, handed a small stipend, and sent on their merry way. Most of these orcs ended up going back to Dagash, where they were horrified to see what had happened to their homeworld. Many of them had been promised that by the elves that they were going to take care of the orcish people, and this was the sacrifice that these orc soldiers had to do so that their people would reap the benefits. Instead, they came back to a inhospitable world where their people were starving and their society was collapsing. The elves, having abandoned it when they realized there was no more ore to process and no more precious stones to mine or any other natural resources that were cost effective to extract from the world. So you have a whole bunch of highly trained veteran soldiers who arrive at their homeworld to see the deplorable conditions thereof. What do? Well, they used their militaristic know-how to seize control of the various bickering clans and tribes throughout their world and establish military or militaristic order over them. They then proceeded to try and make sure their people survived if they couldn't thrive. This was a dark time for the orcs, almost as dark as when the elves were occupying their world, because a lot of the infirm and the elderly and even the young were kind of sacrificed so that the strong could survive. There wasn't simply enough food or other resources around to keep everybody alive. And these military leaders were very pragmatic, if not brutally efficient in their decision-making process. Even with that, it became quite apparent that the Dagash would eventually die as a world without any sort of outside intervention. So using what they knew, the orcs tried to figure out what their options were. They couldn't colonize any other worlds because they were a rather young race and they lacked a lot of the magic and technology of other species. Not to mention most of the closest worlds were already inhabited. They could they didn't have the resources necessary to repair the damage that had been done to their home world. So they couldn't try to improve the environmental standards or anything like that, which left them with very little to work with. The one thing they did have in abundance were a lot of strong, tough, and to be perfectly frank, pissed off orcs at their disposal. So they did what they could. They took they took these previously fractured group of orcs, united them, and trained them in a military complex for to do two things. The first was to go out into the galaxy and sell their services as mercenary soldiers. It was one of the one thing the orcs knew how to do and how to do well was fight. And there are a lot of conflicts going out throughout the galaxy that honestly need soldiers. The other thing they decided to do was what they couldn't buy from selling their services as mercenaries, they would steal. So there are two military kind of functions going on there. The first are the mercenaries. The second are raiders that make their way to the space lanes as well as vulnerable worlds and basically pillage and raid these places for anything that the orcs might deem valuable to bring back to their homeworld. While the orcs lack the technological firepower of some of the other races, they are brutally effective in close quarters. Not to mention the fact, generations of training as soldiers for the elves left them being able to act with military precision, and they imparted this knowledge upon the next generation. So when it comes to the world of Dagash, it is very much like now. I guess the best description is uh, Sparta, or where it's not just every man, but every man and woman needs to know how to fight. Everybody is part of this sort of military complex where they have this entire attitude of you need to be a soldier first and whatever else second, right? Everybody's trained from a young age as to how to wield various weapons of war and how to fight cohesively. These are not chaotic evil orcs if you go by the alignment system that you find in other rule sets. This is more of a I don't want to say lawful evil, but that's about the closest one I can think of right now. Like I said, very militaristic, and these are just the orcs that live in the settlements and what have you. There are still the orcs that there are orcs that have chosen a different way of life, living out in the waste, stealing and killing and raiding for what they need to survive. Those clans and tribes are rather short-lived at most of the time, but those are more of your chaotic evil style orcs if you're going by the alignment system. They're very few in number, and there's, like I said, this has been this drastic change in their society because of what happened to them. Naturally, the orcs refuse to work for the elves, although they're more than happy to work against them. In fact, some species have found that just the suggestion that they might be fighting against the elves results in the rates that the orcs are asking for to be hired for a conflict to be reduced drastically. While the orcs lack the weapons and magic and technology that the elves have, they nonetheless want to enact some sort of revenge upon their oppressors. With that said, I think that summarizes what the orcs are at this point. The one thing I kind of want to mention still, and I know I'm like running well past 25 minutes right now, is how this all ties into cross-species adoption on abundance. Well, Orcish society, they take care of their own sort of deal. Like parents are often soldiers, and so they may not stay at home with their children. They might have to go off to war, in which case their society takes care of their offspring. And orcs live very short and brutal lives, so it's quite possible that both an orc's parents will die in battle. Nonetheless, in these circumstances, um, the the military complex, I guess, takes care of them to raise the next generation of soldiers. However, resources are limited on Dagash. So when a battle goes sideways and a lot of orcs lose their lives, and there are not enough resources to go around to feed everybody who's on the homeworld, the the commanders or war chiefs or whatever you want to call them make the hard choices, often cutting off the old and infirm as well as the young from life-giving medicine, food, and other necessities. This is just the grim reality of the way they live. Um, some cultures outside of Dagash can't condone these actions and can't sit by and let this just simply happen. A lot of them are religious orders. A few of them are just people with a more altruistic philosophy of life. With at their behest, the government of Dagash has allowed several, I guess you call it, orphanages and monasteries to be erected across the world. These are most of them just bring in children, although there's a few hospices that probably tend to the elderly and infirm. The the Orcish people see this as, well, these people were going to die anyways, so if you want them, go ahead and take them. As for these organizations, they try to get these children off world as soon as possible, and there are very few species out there that are willing to embrace the Orcish children, because in part because of most societies or most worlds have been impacted in some way or another, either by the mercenary soldiers fighting against them in armed conflicts, or they've been raided by Orcish raiders at some point or another. One of the worlds, however, that has not been impacted is abundance. Abundance is far enough away from from Dagash that it that nobody's rated it, and nobody really sees it as a critical military like place to conquer or anything like that. So after all, it's sparsely populated, and the only resource it exports is foodstuffs. With that in mind, with their declining population and their aging population, the halflings have openly embraced these orcish orphans that keep showing up, which could create some very interesting interactions in the campaign once it's up and running. If one of the players chooses to play an orc from either society, because if they encounter the other side of the coin, I think it's going to create some interesting drama, if not tension. Anyways, I think I've rambled long enough on this. This is over a half an hour in length, and I'm really, really sorry this took as long as it did. So hoping to get as much about the orcs as possible out there, just to have it in case for later use. Next week, I'm not sure as to what topic I'm gonna jump into. I might do a little bit more about the orcs, or maybe I'll jump into the elven culture since I mentioned it a little in this. Who knows? Anyways, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. Please like and subscribe. I'd love whatever input you are willing to give me on this. And I guess I'll end off with, I hope whenever you roll a d20, it ends up being a critical. Take care.